Hello and welcome to the forum. I'm John Matisonn. On this program, we're talking to David Lewis, founder and director of Corruption Watch. David studied economics at the University of Cape Town and Wits, went into the anti-apartheid trade union movement. After democratic elections, he became head of the Competition Commission and then the Tribunal. And when he left, he wrote Thieves at the Table, which was 9 years ago, and he was already seeing the danger of corruption in its early stages. David, welcome.
Hi, thank you, John.
David, first question. You've got a new report, an annual report out of Corruption Watch this week. Are we winning?
Well, you know, I think we're making progress. It's very difficult to say whether you're winning the fight against corruption. I don't think it's the sort of thing that you ever conclusively win and then the fight ends. I think it's a permanent struggle, if you like. I mean, we've had a pretty excessive time of it during the Zuma administration, and there are a lot of weaknesses in our institutions since then. So I think we've got a long way to go, but I think ground is being made, yeah.
For our audience, I wanted to just ask you to explain why it's not a victimless crime.
Well, it's anything but. I mean, you know, everybody knows, for example, what the effect of corruption at Eskom has been on us, and I think certainly in the Cape, people have clearly felt the consequences of corruption in PRASA, for example. But I think that you don't need to tell ordinary South Africans who the victims are. You know, we are quite unusual. Corruption Watch is quite unusual in that it doesn't only deal with grand corruption, it also deals with what is misleadingly called petty corruption. And this is the kind of corruption that people experience in their everyday lives. So, you know, people who want to get their children into schools, people who want to get their mother into hospital, people who want to get a place in the queue to get a housing allocation, people who confront the police or who are confronted by the police, all experience corruption and its consequences on a sort of daily basis. So I think they know that the consequences of corruption are pretty dire, and they don't have much regard for their state, and they don't have much regard for their public officials. And that has reduced, obviously, trust in those institutions, in the institutions of the state. People believe, rightly so, that their service delivery has been massively impacted upon by corruption. And so those are the victims of the crime. I mean, you don't have the situation where there is a dead body, although I still insist that corruption does kill, but you don't have it's not like a murder case or an assault case or even a robbery where you have a body or you have a broken window or you have stuff that is missing from your house, because the crime is generally a collusive arrangement between two perpetrators, and that means that without somebody blowing the whistle on it, you very rarely get to even discover about these crimes, let alone solve them, let alone investigate them and solve them. So it's victimless in that sense, that you don't easily see the victim, and the reason for that is that the victim is generally the public, or a member of the public who would probably rather not go to the police station and report the crime, or doesn't have any confidence in going to the police station to report the crime. I mean, the upshot of that is corruption is generally a very underreported crime. And yeah, so victimless, certainly not, but is the victim liable to report it? Is the victim easily identified? Also not.
Right. You refer in the report, you say that in the time of COVID, corruption has killed.
Yes, certainly. In the time of COVID, I think corruption very, very visibly killed. But generally, people who are denied housing because of corruption and forced to continue living in shacks, people who are denied jobs because of somebody basically was able to pay a higher bribe to the recruiter, have had their lives put at risk by corruption. So yes, it is. It's a heinous crime, and no less so for its commonplace character. I mean, in COVID, households had lost their access to their sort of miserable hampers and ration packs because local politicians decided to give them, at best, to their constituents only. The nurses who were denied who were denied protective gear. I'm sure there were people who died in consequence of not having the protective gear that was stolen from them. So yes, it's not an exaggeration to say that it kills. It certainly does. I mean, this is apart from the people in Mpumalanga and in KZN who have actually been assassinated, whistleblowers who have been assassinated, competitors who have been assassinated. So, those are the direct murders as a result of corruption. But in general, when people are living at the margins and their margins are narrowed even further, they die or they get very ill.
David, you've driven a lot of change in South Africa over the years. Why is it seems harder than ever to achieve change? Why?
Harder than ever when? I mean, I suppose, the quality of our government has sort of declined over the years. We started off the democratic era with a very strong commitment to social partnership and social compacting. And I think we did rather well at it. I remember working, closely with NEDLAC in those first years.
Right.
And it worked. It worked rather well. I was involved in the negotiations of the Labour Relations Act and then later the Competition Act, both very complex pieces of legislation. We probably took longer than we would have done had we drafted it ourselves, but in the end, there was greater buy-in to the act and to the acts and principles and to the principles that underpinned them, and that got undermined. I mean, firstly by an administration, the Mbeki administration, that didn't really commit itself to social compacting in the same way. I remember when the controversial macroeconomic policy, the GEAR policy, was developed by government. There was no negotiation with NEDLAC, and by specific choice of the government. And as I say, I understood the frustrations. I mean, it was sometimes very frustrating to negotiate every important initiative by government in this form, but it had its advantages. Also, I think that NEDLAC worked very well before the various parties to NEDLAC and the individuals involved in leading those parties got to know each other too well, and where there was a degree of robust, if you like, antagonism, but of a fairly constructive kind, parties to the negotiations. As soon as they got to know each other too well and were on first name terms with each other, and it sort of slid into, well, why don't we rather, meet at your ministerial house on a Saturday evening and have dinner and talk over the differences. So I think that happened. But I think also the parties to the negotiations became weaker and weaker. I mean, the trade union movement at the time was a much more united movement. And, dare I say it, more effectively led for the most part. The civil society organizations were always a sort of disparate group of organizations, and in a sense always will be. So there needed to be a different way of dealing with them, other than to pretend that you had a united civil society front negotiating on their behalf. And businesses fragmented, quite a lot. And so, when you have weak parties to a negotiation, and particularly negotiations as complex as those that are conducted when, the governance of a country is at stake and at issue, you tend, not to have very fruitful outcomes. I mean, that having been said, I mean, obviously then we had the Zuma administration, which had no regard for these kind of processes at all. And so they were really, pretty non-functional. I mean, we were an organization that was formed in the middle of the Zuma administration, and we had very little traction with government. I mean, there were clearly ministers and there were officials who wanted to work with us, some of whom even, got us to say things in public that they felt they couldn't say in public. But that was, as everybody knows, and I don't need to spell out, that was a very dark period for governance in South Africa, not to mention for corruption.
David, we need to take a quick break. We'll be right back with David Lewis of Corruption Watch. And we're back talking to David Lewis, Director of Corruption Watch. David, I mean, what you're talking about goes beyond just not discussing legislation with communities. There's really a breakdown of the National Social Compact, isn't there?
Well, there has been. I mean, there has been a breakdown of that compact. And that has to do with, a breakdown of the institutions that manage the compact, which is what I've just outlined.
Right.
It also has to do with, deep divisions in the society. Arguably, a social compact was always going to be a very difficult thing to manage in a society that came with such a deep history of division, right, and a deep contemporary existence of divisions, economic divisions, social divisions, language divisions, you name it. We had it all. I was saying, before we broke that this, broke down in the Zuma administration because the Zuma administration were frankly not interested in, adventurous approaches to governance as the social compact is. But what has happened is that we now have a president who never loses the opportunity to express his confidence in social compacting as the form of governance. And that's very, very gratifying. I find it very gratifying. And we experience the consequences of that presidential message and that presidential attitude in our dealings with government. I mean, we have a much more fruitful relationship with government than we had, 3 years ago, or whenever it was. And that not only just because we're kind of, politer to each other and more respectful of each other, but, major institutions, not at the sort of national scale of NEDLAC or major initiatives, have been conducted through institutions and initiatives that bring together government, civil society, sometimes the union movement, which as I say, is very weak at the moment, and business. And, we've just concluded negotiating a national anti-corruption strategy, for example. And there were people from government there, from a range of departments of government. There were people from civil society, there were people from business, there were people from the unions. And sometimes when you closed your eyes in that meeting, you didn't know who was speaking, whether the person was from government or from civil society. I mean, there were a lot of differences of opinion, but there was also quite a respectful attitude and not a lot of wasting of time on sort of grandstanding and, big speeches. It was a real working arrangement. Similarly, the Special Investigating Unit has set up a forum in the health sector to deal with corruption, and we're part of that forum, and it's a very fruitful sort of working arrangement. So I think that when you have a change of the sort of tone at the top, as it were, you can forge these arrangements. And maybe it's better for us not to try and forge a grand social contract of the sort that NEDLAC aspired to, but try on an issue by issue basis or on a sector basis to solve problems by coming together. And we do have experience of that. And I think that, here, knowing each other does kind of help. We were watching the president's address yesterday, and somebody commented on how informal South African politics is. Everybody refers to the president as Cyril, or the Mr. Mantashe as Mantashe or Gwede or whatever. That's the way South Africans are. At most, you could get a sort of chief out of somebody. And that does hold us, I think, in quite good stead at the moment. They're not all ministers like that informality, but it's not ever going to go away. And so I think conditions are still fairly auspicious, and as I say, particularly with the president's lead, for social compacting. And I wouldn't give up on it. I just would not be quite as ambitious about it as we were at the beginning. But that too is a bit of a South African fault. We always go for the kind of Rolls Royce rather than the bucky, and maybe our conditions are better suited to the latter than the former.
That brings me to, I was just wondering, am I right in thinking we have some of the best governance rules in the world? We have the Public Finance Management Act, we have the King Commission reports and so on. But there's been so much emphasis on these rules, but not enough implementation.
Well, I think, that's a sort of commonly stated issue. I think that is a problem. And there are a variety of reasons for the problem. I think a bigger problem facing social compacting, and I mean, I alluded to this earlier, is the corruption situation and the lack of trust that has developed in government, and you could call that lack of implementation. I mean, I think it's a lack of trust in government to do anything, and a lack of, will on the part of many public servants and many elected officials to do what is required of them. And so the lack of trust develops and compounds, and those conditions make for an inauspicious environment for corruption. There are also the political divisions. We're still a very young democracy, where one political party views. I mean, we've seen this in the last couple of months, with spades, where one political party views its opponents as sort of enemies of the state. We are not yet familiar with the notion of a sort of loyal opposition.
Right.
And then there are the searing conflicts in the ANC, which make it very, very difficult to know, whether the public official on the opposite side of you, or certainly the minister on the opposite side of you, where he or she is at with the stuff that you're negotiating, or how long they're going to be in office, or whatever the case may be, which is a strange situation, because with the stability, in quotes, with the stability in electoral terms of the governing party, you would think, we could pin these kind of things down. But where you have a situation where there's not really one governing party, I mean, there are at least two governing parties, you don't have confidence that stuff is going to be, as you said, implemented.
Right. I want to come back to the big picture in a moment, but just before we finish the segment, your report says a lot about the police. You make the point that the youth regard the police as the worst institution for corruption in the country. Is there an underlying problem? I know a little while back the police were underpaid. They were caught up in garnishee orders, which meant they couldn't afford to be honest. They were undertrained? Is all that still the case, or have some of these problems been fixed?
I think some of these problems have been fixed. I mean, I think, the underpayment problem, I think, has been fixed. I mean, it's been dealt with, to a significant extent. I mean, I should say about that, I think that any country that is surveyed on corruption, and this is Transparency International's experience as well, will find that the general public consider the police to be the most corrupt institution in the country. And that's for obvious reasons. If you think of the police if you think of corruption as an abuse of power, which is really the standard view of what corruption is, for private gain, then you'll quickly conclude that those with the most power are most likely to abuse it. And I mean, when you have an agency in the country, that has the power of arrest, that has the power to use firearms, that has the power to detain civilians and stop their cars and question them, and whatever the case may be, then you are likely to find that considerable power, which no other agency in the country possesses and no other individuals in the country possess, you're likely to find that abused. I mean, I think South Africa, that having been said, faces quite particular problems. And I think it remains a problem that we inherited from apartheid, where the police were a political arm, essentially, for the most part. And, they've never kind of gotten over that reputation. And so they've, not necessarily behaved as a political arm, but they've, got into corruption in a big way, which they were always into. I mean, they certainly were in apartheid days. But it's a huge problem. I mean, a huge, huge problem. And that's why, for a long time, we thought that dealing with police corruption was above our pay scale. But we just see that there's, no way of dealing with police corruption unless you deal with there's no way of dealing with corruption unless you deal with police corruption. I have to say, we've received quite a positive response from the police, from the senior police officials. And, I don't, claim for any minute that, or we don't claim for any minute that all police officers are corrupt. I mean, by no stretch of the imagination is that true. But a hell of a lot of them are. And the kind of complaints that we get are not necessarily about the police officers who corrupt a massive tender for whatever, but people in their daily lives, police in cahoots with drug dealers in many townships, police who are abusive to women like you can't believe. These are the complaints that we get about police corruption. I mean, there was one very sort of graphic interaction that I recall in a meeting in Cape Town, actually, with communities, where women said that, and I don't know if this is hyperbolic or true, but I suspect it's true, that if you went to the police to report a rape, you were more likely to get raped again than to have your complaint dealt with.
David, on that really dark note, we need to take a quick break. When we come back, I'm going to ask you about some broader issues in terms of the international dimension of this and possible solutions. We'll be right back with David Lewis. We're back with David Lewis of Corruption Watch. David, you seem pleased that you worked on this to get party funding issues improved, but I don't think the problem is solved, and I think these problems are very similar to ones that occur in other countries as well, including the United States, where it's arguably the biggest limitation on the democracy of America. Also, on the international front, I noticed that the Guptas and other accused have fled to India and Dubai, and the problem seems to be we can't get them back. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a problem. I mean, tax havens and I forget the name. What are the treaties the extradition treaties are difficult and cumbersome to manage, and often don't exist with the countries that you precisely want to have them with. But I think it is a general problem, and what you raise about the United States is interesting. I found, I suppose we all did, and we may be guilty of being a bit superficial, but the Zuma playbook, mirrored the Trump playbook in so many ways that it was impossible to ignore. And, I think that what we have is a real crisis in political representation, and, to put it at its starkest, in liberal democracy. Parliaments are just not, functioning. I mean, you have the bizarre situation in the United States where I think the vast majority, I read somewhere just the other day that, Biden's approval rating for for the measures that he's introduced is somewhere in the order of 75%. His approval rating as the leader of the country is much, much lower than that. It's sort of in the 50s.
That's right.
So, what do you conclude from that? That the division between the political parties is not dissimilar to that in our country, or not dissimilar to that between the two factions of the ANC. Politics is warfare. Somebody once said politics is warfare by another means, but or maybe that was about diplomacy, they said. But I mean, this is truly, warfare, and democracies presuppose a different relationship. And in our democracy, for a long time, I thought, well, it's a young democracy, and so somebody goes and hits somebody else over the head with a water jug or whatever. this is an example of the immaturity of our democracy, and we really have to cure it. But I see now that, you know, it's not too dissimilar to democracies all over the world. And in places like Hungary, Russia, you know, many of the old Eastern European societies, and, you know, but not to mention the United States, the United Kingdom. I mean, in France, you know, the president of France could only get elected because he wasn't a member of a political party, you know. And there's very little regard for political parties for good reason. They're viewed as a bunch of, you know, professionals rather than people coming out of their communities to represent them in parliament.
Self-promoters.
And what? Sorry?
Self-promoters.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, so they're not known to their communities. We have a very particular problem in this country, I think, with proportional representation. I mean, I understood why it was introduced in the first place, but I think that we've gone past that, and the cost is too high.
Yes.
Of people not being answerable to their electorates,
Yes.
being answerable to their party. And we've got to, you know, look at getting rid of it or introducing a hybrid system, but people have got to know who their representatives are, and they've got to elect their representatives.
David, I think that's absolutely critical when you think of the fact that we have 10,000 protests every year, and yet you don't go to your MP or your MPC or your town councillor to solve them. I mean, that is a crisis of accountability. But I want to, you know, I write a weekly column on US politics because I used to be accredited to the White House and the Congress and the State Department. And so I've been thinking about this a lot. You know that Biden sees it the same way you've just described, that the problem, President Joe Biden of the United States, that it's a problem worldwide. I mean, we had Trump using the Stalingrad option in court the way that Zuma did. And he's calling a conference later this year of democracies. And he's raising all the same issues, party funding, tax havens, corruption, extradition issues. Have you thought, or do you know, I mean, it seems to me this could be an opportunity for South Africans to make a contribution internationally and get the clout we need, because we're not solving it on our own, and nor is the United States, frankly.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good idea, and I mean, I'm, you know, all in favor of strengthening international governance, and this is an area in which, you know, and the tax haven and extradition treaty stuff is the one that, you know, looms largest or most obvious in this area, and they're important, you know, to achieve some sort of international consensus around this is very important. I mean, it's going to be a little bedeviled by the fact that, you know, two of the most effective, well, Delaware is a great tax haven, for example. London is a great center of money laundering, not to mention the British territories like the Virgin Islands and what have you. And so, you know, the developed nations are not don't have clean hands in this regard by any stretch of the imagination. And agreements will be difficult to achieve. But, you know, I remember about, I don't know how long ago now, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, David Cameron, who when he was Prime Minister of Britain, convened an international conference on corruption, where each country had to make a commitment or commitments to doing something about corruption in their country that they were not doing at the time of the conference. And South Africa, at the height of the Zuma era, was very poorly represented. It never really prepared for the conference in any way. And it came there, and the only commitment it made was to developing a national anti-corruption strategy. Well, I'm pleased to say that about 5 or 6 years later, they've actually honored that, you know, and international commitments are are sometimes difficult to simply ignore.
I understand.
I'm all in favor of that.
David, when I was a United Nations official, I implemented a ban on all TV and radio advertising by politicians in Afghanistan during the elections. And it's possible to achieve. Ironically, of course, we could never have done this in the United States. We're going to go to a break, but I do want to just underline that I think that Biden is providing a masterclass in governing. He's doing a lot. It's a surprise. I know he comes from Delaware State, which is as you describe, but I think there's an opportunity here. We need to go to a break, but when we come back, we'll have our last section talking to David of Corruption Watch. Welcome back. We're talking to David Lewis of Corruption Watch. David, just before we move on, I just do want to underline, I think there's the fact that someone like David Cameron couldn't get much done and that others haven't. And I think there is a fresh opportunity with Biden. Biden is really worried about the future of democracy. He only has one term, so he doesn't have to delay anything. I think it's a real opportunity that South Africa could fruitfully think about.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I agree with you. I mean, I hope that when they do have this conference, they open it to voices other than government voices as well,
Yes.
I think that would be very important. I mean, including from the United States,
Yes.
who have some very interesting civil society voices who could contribute to this.
Right.
But sure, I mean, I think on all fronts, I mean, in the United States, I mean, the one thing that Biden seems to be at a bit of a loss to deal with, for example, the assault on voting rights by the Republican Party, I mean, is a brazen attack on every principle, or the most fundamental principle of democracy, And so we all need each other in this regard. And I think that Biden has put the binary choice, very clearly and very accurately. It's a choice between, democracy on the one hand and Putin and Orbán and Bolsonaro and Duterte and Erdogan and you name them. On the other hand, and the forces of autocracy and anti-democracy are powerful, and they are in charge of powerful countries. So not to mention China, of course.
Right.
But and those seem to be, for a lot of ordinary people, the well-functioning societies. I mean, China is a well-functioning economy. So why not a bit of autocracy if our what often the cause of disaffection with democracy on the part of ordinary people has been the extraordinary inequality associated with liberal democracy. On the other hand, I mean, Russia and China and whatever are not exactly equal societies, but they seem to be functioning, and poverty seems to be being dealt with, at least in China, in some ways. And so people are losing faith in democracy. And so you've got to restore it, not only by getting the governance system right, but by producing the public goods and greater equality in income and wealth.
Yeah, I think, David, that's exactly the moment we're in. And obviously it's full of risks and there have been many disappointments. But for the first time, having followed the United States closely for 40 years, for the first time ever in those 40 years, I feel there's a real opportunity. Biden said last week that your grandchildren are going to be writing their PhD theses on the question of who won with the democracies or the autocracies.
Yes, I saw that, and I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. I wish that was said more often in South Africa, actually. This is about, this is partly about future generations. I mean, you and I will probably, see out democratic governance in one form or another in our countries, but I don't have confidence that our children, let alone grandchildren, would. And this is what it's about.
And I think you're absolutely right. It can't be left to governments, including the South African government. This kind of initiative is going to have to come from Corruption Watch as well as other NGOs around the world. But I think for once, there's the real potential. I want to move back to South Africa just before we run out of time entirely. You testified before the Zondo Commission. What was your message to Zondo, and what do you expect from Zondo?
We've made two submissions to the Zondo Commission. The one is a very comprehensive submission on the capture of the criminal justice system, which we did together with the Institute for Security Studies. And unfortunately, that wasn't the one that we were asked to present an oral submission on. It's that is a really, as I said, very detailed submission that says, that the first institutions in the country that were captured were in fact the criminal justice institutions.
Right.
In that sense, I mean, maybe he was just lucky, but Zuma seemed to have been very prescient and quite well organized. But what we did present oral evidence on was another submission, which is related, and that's about how the processes or lack thereof of appointments of senior leaders of Chapter 9 institutions like, the Public Protector and other institutions like that, and the criminal justice institutions, as well as institutions like SARS, for example, need to be totally and utterly revamped. I mean, some of these positions are at the president's discretion alone.
Right.
The president could appoint the head of the police and the head of the NPA without consulting anybody at all, right, and has done that in the past, I might add. Right. The qualifications for becoming Commissioner of Police in South Africa are much less onerous than the qualifications for becoming a constable in the police force. And so what we've, advocated in that submission is that, just return to first human resource principles, the sort of advertisements and interviews and assessments of integrity and competence that we all had to go through in order to get the jobs that we've gotten, and these must be standardized, and they must be the manner in which the heads are appointed, because I'm convinced that Zuma's principal contribution to state capture, Zuma qua state president, lay in his excessive powers of appointment.
Right.
So, when he wanted to appoint the CEO or massively influence the appointment of the CEO of Transnet and Eskom, he did so. When he wanted at his own discretion to appoint his crony as the head of SARS, he did so. When he wanted to appoint people who he knew were pliable and compliant as head of the Hawks or head of SAPS or head of the NPA, he did so. And it was very gratifying to see the current president, and we've advocated for change in the systems of appointment for a long time now. We've been really sort of batting away at that. And it was very gratifying to see the president appoint the new head of the NPA and the new head of SARS using a somewhat transparent process with an interviewing committee and advertisements and CVs and all those sorts of humdrum things without having to do it. He didn't have to do that. He could have just done it on his own.
Right.
And that does say something about respect for democracy, and all those good things, and transparency and accountability. And that's what we presented to the Zondo Commission, who seemed to receive it very well. I mean, when you think about it, it's a no-brainer how important these appointment powers are.
Right. At some point, it's probably going to require an amendment to the Constitution, and I know that former
It might, yes.
Matisonn has been advocating for that, and saying we have a great Constitution, but we have flaws. David, you're involved in the campaign to have people wear orange masks on Friday. What's that about?
I don't know a lot about the campaign. We are involved in it, but I have to say maybe it's one of my other colleagues who's been most active in it. Look, I think it's the choice of the color orange, I think is obvious. It's really a campaign which wants to see an end to impunity, and it wants people jailed. And I'm afraid that expectations or perceptions rather of whether corruption is seriously being tackled or not do rest in the public mind with whether people are going to jail or not. So it's an important campaign. I just fear that sending people to jail takes a long time. There are appeals and there are constitutional courts and their Stalingrad strategies, which, Zuma has really laid down the playbook for. So I want to say, yes, we also want to see people go to jail. We've been working a lot with organizations, we've been working a lot with organizations like the NPA and the police. But we must also find other ways of punishing people that are shorter term. Like, for example, what the ANC, under very difficult circumstances, sort of managed to achieve the other day, I'd like to see other political parties start to emulate that. I mean, one or two of them have also got people who have been charged with corruption or have dark clouds hanging over some of their leadership,
Well, that's David. Thank you. That's about as optimistic a note as we can end on. I appreciate your time very much, David Lewis, Director of Corruption Watch. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again next week on the forum. I'm John Matisonn.